welcome to Talking Out a Line. As you all know, this show is about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And today's episode will be exploring education and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Our special guest is Dr. Gary Fraser, who is the Associate Dean at Anderson School of Business at UCLA.
Dr. Fraser was an Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion at NYU Stern School of Business and also the Associate Dean of Student Affairs for UCLA, with extensive background in higher education environments in the U.S.
His work before joining academia was in brand management for large brands like Kraft, Sara Lee, and Cadbury Beverages. Now, alongside his work in the diversity and inclusion field in higher education, he's part of the board of directors for the Collegiate Charter High School of Los Angeles.
Let's look into some statistics about the issues education has been facing with diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Education has more impacts in the success of women than in men, and results in more women being involved in activism around women's rights. For example, in the US, 22% of Democratic women have contributed to an organization that takes action in gender equality, which is higher than the 17% of Democratic men who did the same. Both Republican men and women add up to 4% in supporting these organizations.
Let's look at some facts on COVID and education. COVID and education has had a very big impact on Black Americans and how they are impacted financially during the pandemic and how it impacts the pursuit of education.
So Black students owed 15% more than other students after graduation, with an average debt of $34,000, compared with $29,000 for all students, according to 2019 report on race and ethnicity in higher education from the American Council of Education. 1/3 of Black students accumulated more than $40,000 in debt after graduation versus 18% of students overall.
Roughly 4 in 10 Black adults with some college experience or less say they are spending less because they are worried about their personal finances, compared with 22% of Black adults with a college degree who stay the same. 4 in 10 Black adults with some college experience or less say they are worried about paying their bills every day or almost every day.
According to February 2018 study by National Center for Education Statistics, first-gen students are more than twice as likely to drop out within first 3 years than students whose parents have a bachelor's degree. Only 48% of first-gen students are on track to graduate 3 years after enrollment, compared to about 66% of non-first-gen students.
The educational disparity seems to start from a very young age in the United States of America. And as a society, we need to work on building active programs and structures for changing the way in which these barriers impact certain identity groups, such as Black Americans and first-gen students. Let's look at some methods that have been used in education to deal with issues of DEIB. The first methodology that we want to bring to your attention is the Intercultural Development Inventory,
called the IDI, which assesses intercultural competence and the capability to shift cultural perspective and appropriately adapt behavior to cultural differences and commonalities in organizations and businesses.
Another example of work in the world of DEIB has been the University of Michigan, which is often recognized as a leader in intergroup dialogue and has been conducting research and educating individuals in this area for over 30 years now. They define intergroup dialogue as face-to-face meetings between members of 2 or more social groups that have a history of conflict or potential conflict. The groups are broadly defined by race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, ability, religion, socioeconomic class, and other social group identifiers.
Another concept and tool and methodology that has been used since 1976 is the iceberg concept of culture,
which in 1976, Edward T. Hall suggested that culture was similar to an iceberg. He proposed that culture has 2 components, and that only 10% of culture, external or surface culture as he calls it, is easily visible, and the majority or 90% of the culture, internal or deep culture, is hidden below the surface. I've always found this methodology of the iceberg concept of culture extremely useful in education myself, in teaching intercultural communication to my students, as well as using intercultural communication as a methodology for doing consulting work for corporations and organizations alike.
So thank you so much for watching this section on education and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in the United States.
So Gary, thank you so much for being here, and tell us a little bit about yourself and the projects that you're involved in these days.
Well, thank you for having me, Fadia. It's great to connect with you again. And thank you for giving me this time to talk about these important topics. So as you mentioned, I'm currently Associate Dean for the full-time MBA program here at UCLA Anderson. I recently relocated to Los Angeles. Previously, I was at NYU Stern, where we got to know each other, and I served as the Associate Dean for diversity and inclusion at NYU Stern. And in that role, I learned about how we should look at our collective community of students, faculty, and administrators, and really think about our mission towards growing our intercultural competency. And collectively, we want to think about how do we grow our intercultural competency so we can create a sense of belonging for everyone. And that was really our vision, was that every member of our community has a sense of belonging. And so when I had the opportunity to move to Los Angeles and be Associate Dean of the full-time MBA program at the Anderson School of Management, my goal was to bring some of that skill set and that opportunity to our environment here. So right now I'm focused on getting to know our community of students and faculty and administrators so that we all collectively understand how can we grow our intercultural competence. What I find in my work is that everyone needs to grow their intercultural competency in some dimension, in some form or fashion. And if we're all collectively on the same path of doing that, we definitely increase the sense of belonging that we all have in our communities.
So tell me a little bit about what got you interested in IDI as a system and how it can be incorporated into the higher ed environment.
Well, a few years ago, I took an assessment that gave me a sense of what my level of intercultural competency was. And it is called an Intercultural Development Inventory. And it just gives you areas of growth and opportunity. And when I went into my role at NYU Stern, I realized that we can create a community that could be talking about the same language. And so we got, over 50 people trained to give this assessment and give results to our students. We created every student getting the opportunity to take the assessment when they come in and work on this intercultural competence when they grow. I think the thing about it is it opens up the opportunity to have dialogue about not just what we may have in common, but what makes us different. And if we have those dialogues, then we can understand more. And we typically avoid that. And so I really got fascinated in the results of when people go past those barriers they put up for themselves to not explore these differences. And when they start talking about what makes us unique, we realize that we build these better relationships. And so that's the way to build community. And I always feel that roles in any organization, whether it's in the K through 12 space or higher education, it's really about creating community. And you can't create community unless you accept the whole person, not just the things that we have in common. And so a lot of my work is centered around that.
So you were just talking about K through 12 environments as well. And I know from you that you're also part of a board of a charter school. So can you tell me a little bit more about the work that you do there in serving that charter school?
Certainly. I've been fortunate to be on the board of a charter high school, and it's been around for about 7 years now. And we've had great success in terms of taking first generation to the United States and first generation to go to college. High school students that eventually do get into four-year institutions. And it's a challenge because they don't have that network that second, third, fourth generation students have. And so they rely heavily on the school to provide that direction and guidance. The other thing that's important to recognize is that in their communities, the school is in East Los Angeles, there's a lot of people that look like them. And so how do you prepare them to go into this outside world of college that's going to be diverse in ways that maybe they haven't seen before, where they go from maybe being the majority in their neighborhood to being in the minority in whatever school they may attend. And so taking them through that is really important because education, particularly in the high school level, is critical in terms of introducing students to new concepts, ways of thinking. It's not just about the important STEM fields, it's also about, how they adjust to this life as they become an adult. And so the work I do as a board member is really from a governance standpoint to make sure that the charter school has the resources it needs to be successful in terms of delivering a quality education to those students.
Sounds good. And it's really important work to do that mentorship around that time, because not only are there network issues for people who are first generation, but oftentimes there are linguistic issues or cultural issues as well of navigating the application process of college, which can be really daunting for people to understand even the culture of college applications in the United States, which is a sort of a maze of its own. So yeah, and so thank you for that information. So now to more personal questions, because I always like asking my guests that, what does diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging mean to you personally, and how did you arrive at this work? And was it sort of an intentional pathway, or did it happen along the way through your career?
Well, that's a great question. I really think the people that are drawn to this space also draw on the lived experiences that they've had in their life. And so I think I've been able to do that. But, when I talk to students about diversity and inclusion and equity and belonging, I actually start by defining those terms, because we may all think we know what those words are, but we may not be on the same page as to what our understanding is. So we try and get collective understanding. And so we define diversity as, a group of individuals that have different social identities. And, we point out too that there's no such thing as a diverse person. I can't be a diverse person. You can't be a diverse person. You need a group to be diverse. And so that's meant to make sure that someone might identify in certain dominant ways of identifying in the United States. Say a white male Christian heterosexual person may say, well, I'm not a diverse person. Well, no one's a diverse person, but we need that person to be part of the group to make the group diverse. So everyone is part of this diversity composition. And then inclusion is really the state of or action of accepting. Now, what I typically do at that point when I'm presenting, I may show certain visuals. I'm a very visual person, and sometimes I'll show the pictures from the 1950s when the U.S. Supreme Court banned segregation in public schools. And so this was the state of action of accepting. So it was making these previously all white schools inclusive for others. So that's the definition of inclusion. And then I show the pictures of the first Black students in this case that were going into some of those schools. And you can tell from those visuals that you had, one, the definition of diversity, because now you're bringing in Black students into a previously all white environment. And you have inclusion because the US Supreme Court ordered that they had to be included. But all is not well. When you look at those pictures, we can easily Google and go back and look at those pictures and see that those Black students did not have a sense of belonging. They probably weren't treated equitably. And so that's why it's important to define all these terms. Belonging is the outcome of diversity and inclusion done right. If you feel an environment is inclusive in a way that you're wanted, not just that you're accepted, and it's equitable, so you have the same opportunities as anyone else, then you will then start to feel a sense of belonging. So those words all come together, but the one that's the key is actually belonging, because that's the output. You can create an equitable environment, you can say it's diversity and inclusion pulled together, but just like with those students in that picture, the story isn't done there. And really the thing that was missing was this level of intercultural competence. If those white students knew more about what it's truly like to be a Black student in that environment, if those Black students knew maybe more about what it was like being a white student in an all white environment and having to then deal with integration, maybe that experiment really would have worked a little better. So the key is really intercultural competence. And for me, I took to intercultural competence a few years ago when I did start to think about it this way. It was kind of the answers to so many questions. Why did I feel out of place sometimes when I was the only person in the room? Why did I feel that I wasn't fully connected to a work group, even though we were doing the same work? And it's really that, people were accepting me for what we shared. We might have had the similar experiences. I have an MBA, for example, and I was working with a team of other people at MBA. So we had similar experiences, but we didn't get to the depth of understanding what makes us different and unique. And so we're not seeing the full person. And so most of my career, I never felt a sense of belonging because I didn't have the courage to talk about these differences. And likewise, those didn't want to talk about those differences because they were typically seen as taboo. You know, we always are told the two things we should never talk about at work is politics or religion. And that's because those can be charged topics. And really, it's about how do you have those conversations? If it's about dialogue where you're just listening and not passing judgment, you can have those conversations. And so this work actually helped me grow and helped me think there's a way to help others grow as well too. And so I've been really inspired by this way of thinking that, you know, we're not really trained to do. Typically, we're taught to avoid those differences and to focus on the things that make us similar to each other, so things could be settled and okay. But until we explore these differences, we're not going to build these deeper relationships we need to have to create that true sense of belonging.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And you and I have had many conversations about this whole idea. And it's the reason why I started doing this work as well, because I found it very valuable to find a framework to understand and navigate differences and to work with communities to actually help them realize the importance of embracing differences and understanding it and working through them. So just agree with you in about everything that you just said. And also, I think that's amazing. I've not really thought of using those historical photos that you spoke about, but those are extremely good examples of showing the different stages of diversity, state mandated inclusion, followed by the clear lack of belonging in those photos that the Black children felt when they were walking in, and sometimes they had armed forces walking them in that famous photo of little Black girl that is walking into with armed forces. So that's just
you know, and you know, we both do work with organizations, and you know, many times organizations say, well, we're working hard on diversity and inclusion, but we haven't figured it out yet. And the core is, as you know, it's because they're stopping at diversity and inclusion. They're not thinking, how do we create a sense of belonging? And typically organizations don't want to use that term belonging because it's touchy-feely. How do you define belonging, right? And I think the reality of it is that it has to go beyond the numbers of saying we have the numbers that create diversity, because if you don't have that sense of belonging, the thing that a lot of organizations don't look at is retention. Are we retaining the people that are diversifying the organization? And if you don't have the sense of belonging, then you're going to leave. And that's why companies still have the problems of what that they do.
Exactly. And when you leave and there's no loyalty to where you work and where you belong, that's when the organizational performance and stability and growth can't happen in the ways that it could if people worked on, entities worked on their belonging factor. So absolutely. So what do you think are the unique challenges that are presented in the education workplace? So in this case, you can feel free to talk about education as a whole in the US and or higher ed versus K through 12, because being both of us being from the higher ed industry, I feel that there are specific challenges, but I'd love to know from your perspective what they are.
Yeah, and I think you talk to people, you'll get a lot of different perspectives, but I do think that one of the major challenges are from the history standpoint. We don't really teach American history in the United States. We teach a piece of American history, you know, and usually it's a positive piece of American history. But until we talk about the true history of enslaved people in terms of oppression of many different, you know, races and ethnicities, whether it was, you know, Japanese internment camps or the way Chinese were treated when they first came to the United States. There's so much history that is important because the country looks very different than it did 30, 40, 50 years ago. And we've had this history of kind of burying the things that make the country not look great. And so now you have people graduating the K through 12 system, going to college and even higher education beyond that. And they don't understand this foundational piece. And the thing we do know geographically, as much as the country is getting more diverse, it's not that neighborhoods are. And so people tend to live in neighborhoods that represent people that look like them. And that's their network, according to all these different ways of identifying. And so now when you smush people together in college and not knowing this past history, not engaging with people who are different than them, then they tend to avoid, building those relationships. And that makes the work at the higher education level that much more difficult. When someone goes away to college, they're looking for comfort because they're away from what they know. So they look for similarities. They don't look for differences. And sometimes students do, but for the most part, they're looking for things that make them comfortable. And so organizations and certainly higher education needs to challenge itself to make sure that not only they're putting people together who are different, but they're focusing on how they develop these skills of discovery about differences. And that could be in the classroom, but it also can be co-curricularly as well too. It could be in the student experience, in and outside the classroom. And I think most organizations, most higher education institutions, they don't maybe have the collective skill set to deliver on that need. And so it usually gets unfulfilled. You may have someone who is in a chief diversity officer role, but they may not have a full staff that's focused on this effort. They may be more of a problem solver when something arises. And really the challenge of diversity and inclusion work in general, in higher education and in other organizations, is that it started out more as a compliance issue, right, with affirmative action and things like that, not as a true integration and a true building a sense of belonging. It's more that we have to do it this way, so we will do it this way, as opposed to we are better if we do it this way. And so that happens in higher education, and it starts in K through 12 because we don't have that history that's really being educated and taught to students. And it carries out in college. And unless you specifically want to seek out that coursework, you're not going to know. And really, in theory, people should know before they get there. And we've always been trained to kind of just avoid these differences. So it never really gets dealt with. And now you have people graduating from college and going into the workplace without having that true exploration of what difference means and how I engage with someone who's different based on what makes them different.
Right. And can't emphasize the importance of that work. And I think on top of what you said, another thing I wanted to add that I noticed that is a challenge in higher ed is that higher ed, I think, is entrenched with very many highly educated people who have their trainings from older paradigms that are not so inclusive to begin with. And as a result of it, it is difficult to, I feel, in this environment, even though both you and I have higher learning degrees, at the same time, I feel that a lot of our colleagues have those degrees as well. And there's a sense of sort of ownership about the expertise of what we have based on our degree. And in a field and in an industry where so many people are so highly educated, I think there is a matter of personal egos that we need to move beyond. That's been my observation, because I think in a non-PhD workforce where not everybody around you has a higher degree like a PhD, I think there's more of an acceptance of wanting to change ways. Because as I'm doing this work in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in multiple industries, I'm seeing that academia has its own limitations because of the level of education that everyone has. I feel like we all feel we are experts and we don't want to be questioned on the paradigms that we have been trained at and that give us our big name of being a doctor.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I think the challenge also is, for the most part, not fully throughout, a lot of institutions that, are in this higher education space tend to be liberal and they tend to be liberal, predominantly white environments. And so you would think, well, then they want diversity. And maybe in theory, they do want diversity, but they're using systems that doesn't promote diversity, right? We're using systems like for even evaluation, even the SAT, you can draw two parallel lines. One is average household income, and the other is average SAT score. And as average household income goes up, so does average SAT score. But we use it as such a major deciding point, but we're basically eliminating lower income people because they don't have the resources to get a higher score. And at the same time, when you break down those lower income people, it tends to be people that are not traditionally white, and so, or don't have a history, right? And maybe a first generation, because they don't have the tutors or the resources to do well in that exam. And that plays out whether people are entering PhD programs, the schools, PhD programs, there's a lack of diversity. So then you're hiring faculty, and they may be, again, liberal in their views, and they may say they want diversity, but they're using sources that don't have the diversity they need to diversify. And they're not sure how to work around that unless they kind of dismantle some of that process. And then when they bring in people in the organization, in any of these schools, they are happy that they're there, but they're not happy enough where they're going to invest in really understanding who they are, what makes them different, exploring those conversations. And those people that might diversify the organization aren't comfortable because no one looks like them, and no one's, trying to understand what makes them unique and different, and celebrating that, as opposed to hiding it. In large organizations, we're kind of told to kind of, conform, go with the cultural norms. And typically we want people around us who we're comfortable with. And those are typical people that look like us. And so that cycle keeps competing with itself and keep happening over and over again. And as a result, you have people in those organizations that don't feel a sense of belonging. You have a liberal population that wants it to be more diverse, but they don't know how to invest to make it more diverse in a way that people that come in feel truly a part of that team and that culture.
So the work that you're doing is obviously about developing intercultural competence in the workspaces that you're using this methodology, and at the same time you're a Black man in higher education. So how does that sort of come together in terms of the way in which you feel in your workplace with your identity, doing work on building the competency that you're looking for, as well as the work that you're doing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, being in a culture and also in higher ed, which is so white?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to what I was referring to earlier. It's really about drawing on lived experiences. I think I've had these combinations of experiences that's allowed me to do well in these environments. I've been fortunate, even though I'm first generation, to get a college degree in my family. I was fortunate to go to, some private schools, and private education exposed me to all different, races, ethnicities, ways of identifying. And so I've gotten comfortable interacting with people that are different than me, and I think that that's allowed me to engage with people on commonalities, because I'm not suggesting we throw that out the window. We always have to engage on commonalities to build a base of comfort. But the key is, at some point, you have to introduce the differences and challenge people, inspire people to absorb those differences, to learn about those differences, to have conversation about those differences. Because as you do, you're seeing that whole person, that person feels more valued, because we're not just talking about the things we have in common. I'm not just talking to someone about the fact that, I have an MBA from here and someone has an MBA from there. I'm talking to them about, what holidays do I celebrate based on how I identify, and versus someone else, and what they mean to me. Those are the conversations we need to inspire people to have. But you have to create this foundation of commonality, because then people start to develop trust and connectivity, and then they will then eventually take the chance to say, okay, yeah, I can have this conversation about difference. I will ask you a question about what it's like being, maybe one of the few Black deans in an environment that's, predominantly white. Those are conversations that people should feel comfortable asking. But because of this construct of the history of affirmative action and racism and retaliation, people shy away from that. And so it's creating a level of comfort so people can have those conversations, and not just with me, but with other people as well too. And think about how they can expand, their network. I teach an executive MBA class, and one of the topics we talk about are these leadership development skills. And these are general leadership development skills, but it applies to this space. And that is, we have to learn how to value differences as opposed to going with what we're comfortable with. So someone's going to have a different perspective because of their different lived experiences. And we have to value that they're bringing that to the table. We have to understand how we manage ambiguity. We may say, we want the environment to be more diverse. So what does that exactly mean? And how do we know when we're there? We have to be accountable. We can't just say, we try diversity and inclusion. We're still trying. We're not there yet. We have to hold ourselves accountable. Why aren't we there yet? And what are we going to do different?
And it's a process.
It's a process. It's an ongoing thing. It's
you have to
exactly
build organizational muscle. It's not like we're not there yet. I think that approach is not helpful.
Exactly. And that's what's great about, this assessment we're talking about is that it's a journey, there's no point where you're going to say we are perfect. And that's one of the problems with organizations. They want to say that their culture is great and they're looking for people to fit the culture. And you really want people who are going to enhance the culture. The culture is never perfect. And unless you say, we want people that's going to add to the culture, enhance the culture, you're going to really be stuck in the cycle of just bringing in people that are like you. Because you want them to fit the culture. And so you're finding the same people. And unless there's an evaluation, say, how does this person add to who we are to make us better? You're not going to really truly diversify. And you have to value that difference as well, too. And so that's the challenge that organizations all struggle with. And so, my work is really about that, even though my role as Associate Dean for the full-time MBA program is how we admit our students, how we provide career services, our student culture, student affairs. But in that is naturally weaved in, as opposed to being separate. I mean, we certainly have great resources, we have a great chief diversity officer, but it's how do we weave in all these concepts into the everyday life of the student and the school, so that it's not something that's treated on the outside. It's something that's baked into what we do.
Great. So to sort of wrap up, I would like you to give two sets of advice, one for educational institutions that you think could be doing in order to make it more diverse and equitable and create inclusion and belonging. And on the other hand, the other set of advice I would hope is to give out to people of BIPOC communities who want to be change makers in higher ed as well as K through 12. What do you think is an advice that you want to give them to sort of continue in their work of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
Yeah, great questions. Well, first for organizations, I really think that they have to think about how they create systems that empower all different groups of people. So a lot of times people use the term employee resource groups. I'm not a fan of that because it makes it seem like we're creating this group so that group supports itself or gets support or provides a resource for each other, and it makes it seem like it's not empowered. I like the term affinity groups because it's people who share an affinity, some aspect of how they identify, but they're empowered. And when I say empowered, I mean that the organization, whether it's higher education or anyone, needs to say, how do we connect with you to find more people that's going to diversify who we are? Let's plug into your network, because most of us have a network that looks like us. And so why not empower these affinity groups to diversify the organization? And the thing with diversifying organization, talk about, ambiguity and accountability. I always say, look at metrics. Look at the demographics of a city, look at the demographics of your student population and say, these things should match up. Our faculty should match up with what our students look like. Our administrative pool should look like what our geographic area looks like. And what you have to do is then say, how do we over-index on the things we're short on so that we can get to where we need to get to? And it's a constant process, right? Because all these demographics change anyway. So there has to be a plan that is put in place that really gets to some of this ambiguity, as opposed to just saying we want a diverse environment. One of the things I talk about here is we want to educate our students with sources that represent those students. So that means a certain percentage should be outside the United States, because we have students from outside the United States. Certain whether it's class content or speakers should represent people who identify as Black or Indigenous people of color. We should make sure that there's a certain percentage that is not male, because a lot of the data is male in terms of case studies and things like that. And so that's the things that organizations can do. For people that are interested in getting to this space, it's really about broadening and expanding network. It's having conversations with people that are in the space to learn more. It's a collective community, and there's so many great ideas out there. I love talking to people about all these different ideas because I end up learning things as well too. And but it's this mindset of going into an environment that doesn't want someone to make the change as an individual, as a leader, someone that wants an organization that wants someone to come in as a leader to engage everyone in this journey. It's exactly what you're saying. It's a journey. It's not just you take a workshop and you're done. It's you change the way you think, the way you act, and you do it ongoing. And so someone who wants to lead that or participate, because as long as you come in as a participator, you can then make a difference for other people and set a great example. So it's expand the network so you can engage with people about these topics, but always grow. It's a growth mindset in all these different dimensions. You know, I sometimes travel. I went to Israel a couple of months ago on this great program that was built just so people can understand Jewish culture better. That's something that I'd never really taken the time to explore. And so it's a journey for all of us in all these different dimensions. And I think that's what we need to do is constantly challenge ourselves that way.
Great. Yeah. So there's just so many things about what you said that are really interesting and apt for this show. Especially loved the way in which you defined in the beginning your versions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because I think the images part is sticking with me, and I'm definitely going to be requesting you for the final version of this episode to send me those photos that you're
Sure.
using, because I would love to show that to our audience. I think they would really enjoy that. And very, very last question before you go, which is, where can people go to connect with you if they want to connect with you about any of the work that you're doing?
Well, I think for me, LinkedIn is kind of my go-to source. So people can easily follow me there or try and connect. And certainly if there's questions, I love having this conversation with everybody and anybody. Like I said, I think I grow from them as well. And so certainly anyone can feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty easy to find on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Gary Fraser, for being with us today to talk about education. And I'm glad that we were able to get a glimpse of U.S. higher ed as well as K-12 through all of your work experiences, and wishing you luck going forward. And thank you again.
Fadia, it's been great talking to you again. I look forward to next time. Thank you.
Thank you.